Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. Story for you today from Real Clear Politics. We digitize the mob, and there's no place to hide, by Frank Mealy. Why can't our leaders bring themselves to condemn antisocial violence? The most shocking aspect of the wave of rioting and destruction that has been unleashed in many of our American cities in the wake of George Floyd's death is not that there is an underlying discontent with the rate of progress in racial equality. That is understandable. That is not what is not is the way mayors, governors, and members of Congress have not just tolerated but endorsed mob violence as an acceptable weapon of social change. Growing up in the turbulent 60s, I was given a very specific warning by my mother. If you ever get caught up in a mob, get out of it as soon as possible because a mob has no brain. It just has emotion. And whether that emotion is anger, hatred, or even joyful exuberance, it cannot be controlled. We saw that in Minneapolis following the death of George Floyd while in police custody. People with a brain were outraged by what they saw. They wanted to protest, to speak out, to demand justice. But when they came together in the streets, they discovered how quickly protest can transform into a riot, and how demands for justice can be used to justify injustice. The basic premise of justice, after all, is recompense, making sure that wrongdoers pay a price for their crime. Yet there was no recompense in burning the businesses of innocent bystanders. There was no justice in stealing TVs and PlayStations. It was shameful, and it should have been easily condemned by the politicians, news media, and celebrities who were not part of the mob. That's what would have happened in the 60s when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, leading to riots in America, across America in 1968. Bobby Kennedy appealed for peace amidst this mindless menace of violence in America, which again stains our land and every one of our lives. The parallel is exact. A black man is unjustly murdered. The nation is outraged. Riots ensue. The only part that is missing today is a respected grown-up like Kennedy who would condemn the violence and recognize that it is not the concern of any one race. Okay, well, you can read the rest of the article there, but I think that gives a gist of it. You'll note that that echoes something I've said in this space here previously, and I want to tease out that relationship here next. First off is the notion that the mob has no mind. You have to understand that the whole purpose of this mob and these riots were to give the mob a mind. This was not a spontaneous uprising in a lot of ways. What would happen, you see this reported time and time again in the cities where it occurred, is that you would have a gathering of people, some protesters who legitimately were protesting what you thought they were. Police abuse, the unresponsiveness of the judicial system to some of the citizenry, ongoing corruption. Those were the kind of things that were out in the streets to protest. But they were taken over by people who came in from outside with a different agenda. Antifa is a mob that's standing. They don't form when something comes up. They're always there, waiting to exploit an issue and come on and stir the mob. In socialist doctrine, there is a well-known approach that Antifa uses, and that is that when you want to stare a mob, you don't need a majority of the people out in the streets to do that. You need 2 or 3 people who are going to operate in lockstep to a preconceived plan. It's much like herding cattle when you think about it and what the drovers do, right? So what happened in these cities was you would see evidence of pre-planning for the riots. You would see pallets of bricks suddenly appear far from the site of any construction project. Somebody had to buy those. Somebody had to place those. And that was done before those bricks would be picked up by the rioters and thrown through windows. You see a similar thing where we've seen coverage of people driving around handing bricks to rioters. They're in cars. They're not rioting themselves, but what they're doing is delivering the items to riot and loot to people so that they can do that. Okay. You see ads for rioters where they would actually pay people to show up and do this. And then there were complaints after that once these people found out that no, this was illegal and they were arrested and they were facing time in court. Yes, they may have paid their bail, but they were still looking at a potential 10 years in prison for rioting and looting. And they were very surprised by this. How did they get involved in it in the first place? It was because somebody beforehand reached out to them and recruited them to do this well in advance of the actual action. Okay, so this is a mob with a brain, and it's being steered specifically to avoid the justice angle of this. For example, in Minneapolis, where George Floyd died, it was Amy Klobuchar, the Democrat presidential candidate, I've said this many times now, who was the actual attorney general in the DA's office there, who refused to punish the very police officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he was saying he couldn't breathe. That officer, Chauvin, came up before her a number of times with complaints of brutality, etc., on his record, and she declined to prosecute. So you would say justice would demand that Amy Klobuchar answer for that refusal to prosecute to the people, because that cop would have been off the force if she had. You have the police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department. Those complaints come to him first. So why wasn't he held to account by the people for his role? You have the mayor of the city of Minneapolis, who oversees all of this. Why wasn't the mayor called to account for all this? You have the governor of the state of Minnesota, likewise, responsible for all this. The politicians were never held to account. City councilmen, they have a say in this. They control the budget, right? Why were they not held to account for all this? And I'll tell you why. They were not held to account for any of this because all those people I just mentioned are Democrats. And so the whole point of Antifa was to steer the wrath of the people from the Democrats to small business owners in the downtown area, who, by the way, are less likely to be Democrats. Sure, some of them are, but that's a demographic that tends to be, if anyone's voting for Republicans in downtown Minnesota, that's who is. Okay. So the whole point was to steer the mob towards targets which were more useful to the Democrat Party. And that is what they did. So there's no mystery here as to why these Democrat politicians are not speaking up to condemn the violence. They welcome the violence. The violence is what they're using as an excuse to do two things. Number one is to extend their police state powers that were put in place during the lockdown. They want more power. They want more power that they don't have to go back to the people to get. Number two is to get absolution for the previous incompetence and crimes they've committed. So more power, less accountability. That is what the Democrats are after here, and that's what they're getting here. And it serves their overall political purpose. The whole reason they're doing this across the fruited plain in 2020 is because Donald Trump threatens their aggregation of power and their lack of accountability. That's what the whole point of draining the swamp is. is to remove power and apply accountability to the would-be ruling class here in America, which is the Democrat Party, and then their second stringers in the Republican establishment. So it's a very simple thing here. It's got a lot of tendrils, but it's a very simple strategy which is being pursued here, a very simple set of values which are on display. On the one hand, you have the Democrats who are showing that they will engage in any amount of criminality in order to gain power and to reduce their accountability. Any amount. When you see people being murdered and raped and businesses being burned to the ground, that is safe to say. It is no mystery why they are not condemning this. Because this is the vehicle that they're using to get what they want. They are pushing full speed ahead for their agenda, which is now synonymous with the left-wing agenda. Ideologically, if you are not in the socialist camp, well, you aren't driving the Democrat train anymore. The liberals who used to run the party are gone. They have no power anymore. They have no voice anymore. This is being run by the Stalinists within the party. That's why you see all the communist propaganda from Antifa. That's why you see George Soros bankrolling so much of this activity. That's why you see the Chinese communists bankrolling this activity. They've caught Chinese counterfeit dollars being spread around to hire the rioters. Okay? That's what this is all about here. So no mystery why you don't see people condemning it. They're benefiting from it. Okay? Why aren't the Republicans doing more about this? Well, why aren't the Republicans doing more about anything? You know, a large part of the Republican Party is nothing more than people who hold the coats for the Democrats while they do these sort of things, because they want to be on the Georgetown cocktail party circuit. They benefit from being the second string ruling class, what have you. How many committed conservatives and libertarians do you have in the Republican Party? Not many. Not many. It's ironic that Donald Trump, who was never really considered to be a diehard right-wing conservative throughout his career, really, who was somewhat suspect when he ran for the office and was not exactly welcomed by the conservative glitterati out there. He was condemned explicitly by National Review, William F. Buckley Jr.'s magazine that has since fallen into a state of leftist disrepair. Well, he's turned out to be the most rock-ribbed opposition to this leftist coup that one could ask for. Perhaps it's only out of pure stubbornness or ego, but he's the only one who is fighting this, and he doesn't have a lot of allies, not even in his own cabinet. You know, he's being fought by them as well as being fought by the left. So as we see this play out, I would ask a different question, and that's what I'll leave you with today. In a country which monitors every phone call, every email, as we've seen, the NSA, the National Security Agency, along with the CIA and the FBI, is capable of monitoring every communication between any two Americans in this country all the time. Are you telling me that you can't identify who the rioters are? We assembled this whole apparatus not to enable Barack Obama's blackmail state, which is what it turned into, asked General Flynn, but in order to protect ourselves from terrorists operating domestically. These rioters are terrorists operating domestically. It's not spontaneous, it's controlled. And to control it, you have to communicate. So are you really telling me that there's nobody who's listening to those communications? Are you really telling me that we don't know who the leaders are doing this? Are you telling me that we couldn't identify every single one of these brick-throwing, rapist, murdering rioters and haul them into court tomorrow? No, my friends, I just simply don't believe it. There's been too much that has come out about how this FISA process works and the quality of the data that they're getting on it for me to believe that we don't have the capability to do that. It is a case of lacking the will. And the question I will leave you with today, my friends, is this: why do we not have the will to target and take down the leaders of the rioters who are burning down our cities? Have a great day.